If that's not enough to convince you that Final Fantasy VI is one of the most legendary video games of all time, then perhaps a little verbal persuasion might help. It successfully combines all of the greatest aspects of its predecessors and packages them together in what is an astoundingly well-crafted game on every level of development. It's visually stunning, mechanically sound, and showcases what is easily the most powerful soundtrack of any of the 2D Final Fantasy games. But perhaps you're still unconvinced. Perhaps you started playing games in the late 90s and wonder how anything could top the goldmine that was the PlayStation 1 era of Final Fantasy games. In that case, allow me to delve a little deeper and show you why Final Fantasy VI is considered by so many to be the best in the series. Development of Final Fantasy VI began, as had become the custom, immediately after the release of its predecessor. One particularly interesting thing to note is that for the first time in the series, Hironobu Sakaguchi did not take the helm as the game's director. Due to a promotion to Executive Vice President of Squaresoft, as well as a schedule that was divided by many projects, he was simply unable to be as intimately involved in the creative process for Final Fantasy VI as he had been for the previous games. In his stead, he chose two of his most talented team members to take the helm, Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito. Kitase had worked closely with Sakaguchi on Final Fantasy V as an event scripter, where he had been in charge of the pace, expression, wording, and musical transitions of scripted scenes. Ito had been the lead battle designer for the series since Final Fantasy IV, being the man responsible for designing the active time battle system, as well as the incredibly robust class-changing system of Final Fantasy V. With these two at the head of development for Final Fantasy VI, the result was a powerful culmination of all that was great in both Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy V. But while these two may have been billed as the directors, they've admitted in interviews that the development for the game was much more of a collaborative effort and a hybrid process. Sakaguchi still provided the overall scenario, but it was up to Kitase to flesh out the details of the story. He wasn't alone though. For Final Fantasy VI, one of the core ideas behind the design process was that every playable character in the game would be considered a main protagonist. And in order to accomplish this, every member of the development team was given a chance to express their ideas for who the character should be and how their episode should unfold. Terra and Locke were conceived by Sakaguchi, Celeste and Gao by Kitase, Shadow and Setzer by graphic director Tetsuya Nomura, and Edgar and Sabin by field graphic designer Kaori Tanaka. Once the character concepts had been fleshed out, it was Kitase's responsibility to weave them into a cohesive narrative. But the scenario for Final Fantasy VI was written by a group of at least 4 or 5 people. Final Fantasy VI opens up on one of the most unique worlds in the series, one that is vastly different from the common medieval setting shared by the previous 5 games. This world is highly influenced by technology, equivalent in many ways to that of the Second Industrial Revolution, though the design feels a bit more like something out of a Jules Verne novel. In the first scene, we're introduced to a girl named Terra, a slave soldier of the Gestalian Empire, and the only known human being with natural-born magical abilities. Luckily, the Emperor's influence over her is finally broken, and she's taken into protection by a rebel faction known as the Returners. Though they too wish to use her abilities to gain an upper hand in the war, they ultimately respect her freedom and wait for her to make her own decision, rather than forcing her to fight against her will. While Terra reflects on who she is and what she believes in, we're introduced to the largest and most varied cast of characters in the entire series, many of which are given an elaborate backstory that quite nicely establishes their personalities and motivations. While I don't have time to go into detail on each character, I think it's sufficient to say that it's a great pleasure to explore each one of their personal stories. And there are many scenes in the game that, while perhaps not contributing to the main plot, provide tremendous depth to the characters themselves. This intricate weaving between subplot and main plot left me unable to feel anything but sympathy and admiration for each character. And in my opinion, the background scenes often turned out to be more effective on an emotional level than the more central and pinnacle moments of the main story. That's not to say that the main plot is lacking, though. One could hardly complain about a story that contains one of the most widely appreciated story twists in video game history. It's a narrative that rises and falls steeply in its tone, but never feels inconsistent, and I would go as far as to say that it strikes a perfect balance between its humor, tragedy, and triumph. I've never been the biggest fan of the way it was originally translated, with some of the dialogue feeling out of place to me, but there's so much of it that's truly effective. One of the game's crowning achievements, however, is embodied in its villains, and specifically in a psychotic but powerful sorcerer named Kefka. While Kefka's backstory is largely unexplored, I feel it only adds to his mysterious, chaotic, and unpredictable nature. The brief information we are given details the cruel experiments performed on him in order to attempt to infuse a person with the magical abilities of espers, a lost but powerful ancient species. These methods were later abandoned, but the damage to Kefka's psyche was irreversible, warping his mind into a nihilistic state which caused him to be utterly detested even among his own ranks in the Empire. While it seems apparent that Emperor Gestal has Kefka firmly under his control, it quickly becomes evident that Kefka is not as subservient as he first appeared, and the beginnings of a cruel and insidious plot begin to reveal themselves. One reason I like Kefka so much in comparison to previous villains in the series is because he breaks almost every convention that the others fell into. He's not an evil god or some other higher life form. He doesn't exemplify a dark, commanding presence. He isn't 10 feet taller than the protagonists or armored from head to toe. He doesn't embody in any way the appearance or personality of a traditional Dark Lord, and in some ways is actually portrayed as a weak and frail sidekick, not unlike Gilgamesh in Final Fantasy V. At his core, Kefka is simply a despicable human being, which, unsurprisingly, turns out to be a great recipe for a compelling antagonist. Visually, Final Fantasy VI is stunning even after 20 years. I've always appreciated pixel art throughout my life, and this game has some of the best ever created. One noticeable improvement made over previous entries comes in the scaled-up character sprites while exploring the world map and towns. In previous games, the character sprites for exploration were much smaller than the battle sprites, but for Final Fantasy VI, the battle sprites were used for exploration as well. This gave the animators a lot more room to be expressive with the characters' facial expressions and emotions, building upon what had been experimented with in Final Fantasy V. Another interesting change comes in how the world map is rendered. In Final Fantasy IV and V, the world map appeared flat when the player traversed it on foot, but would change to Mode 7 rendering when taking to the skies in an airship. In Final Fantasy VI, however, the world map is always rendered with Mode 7, giving it a pseudo-3-dimensional look even when walking. When the player does take to the skies, or when riding a chocobo, the full power of Mode 7 is utilized, giving the player a view of the world that is altered dramatically from the previous games in the series. All of the backgrounds, monster designs, and architecture are artfully crafted as well, making for a visually appealing experience that perfectly fits the atmosphere of the game. With all of this care and attention given to the finer details, I think it's safe to say that Final Fantasy VI is one of the most visually impressive games of all time. Of course, while the story and visuals are great, the game also shines in its battle mechanics and equipment customization. The character customization in this game is primarily centered on your equipment setup, and the way the player manages Magicite can have an enormous effect on late-game stats and party builds. Magicite are the crystal remains of espers, which grant the wielder with magical abilities. It's essentially the means by which magic is learned in the game, and it can be switched freely between each character whenever the player sees fit. Each Magicite teaches the character specific abilities at varying rates. As you can see here, the Siren Magicite can teach a number of abilities, which are learned by accumulating magic points earned in random enemy encounters throughout the game. So basically, at the end of a battle, the player receives a certain number of magic points. Some enemies award more than others, but this number is then multiplied by the learning rate attribute in order to determine the overall progress of a character in learning that spell. What this means is that the system provides the option for every character to learn every spell in the game. Some people will criticize this, arguing that it only leads to your party being extremely overpowered and makes the game way too easy. However, it isn't always advantageous to have every character working on learning magic. It all depends on the character's base stats. As we can see here, Terra's base stats establish her with an incredible aptitude for magic power, which leads to her inflicting extensive damage when she casts spells. Cyan's magic power, however, is significantly lower, causing him to inflict minimal damage with magical attacks. While you can certainly equip Cyan with Magicite and have him cast spells the same as Terra or any other character, he's quite simply ineffective in that role, which makes it more strategically sound to use him in other ways. Another interesting thing about Magicite is that they often give special bonuses to characters who have them equipped upon leveling up. For example, the Zone Seek Magicite provides a +2 to magic power at every level up, while the Bismarck Magicite provides a +2 to strength, and so forth. With careful planning, this makes it possible to boost each of your character's stats to make them an extremely powerful group collectively. There's a downside to all of this customization though. First of all, it can sometimes be overwhelming, and there are many people who might want to just get on with the game rather than sit for several minutes and carefully plan. I do have to admit that keeping track of so many different things at once, especially when watching each character's level ups and equipping them with the appropriate Magicite, can definitely hurt the pace of the game. It makes it much longer than necessary to get through dungeons, especially the higher level dungeons that award a lot of magic points and experience. Constantly stopping and switching around Magicite and equipment for each battle can become tedious very quickly. While I love the strategy involved, it does start to feel cumbersome. The worst examples of this are the dungeons in the game where the player has control of multiple parties. While these dungeons have fun puzzles to solve that require each of the player's parties to work together to proceed, it can be incredibly time-consuming to optimize your characters each time you make a switch. Of course, this criticism only applies to those who like to optimize their characters. If you're more concerned with just experiencing the story at a casual pace, then none of this customization is required and can be skipped altogether. While for the most part I love this game, there are a few majorly misguided design choices that I feel inclined to point out. First of all, I absolutely hate the Veld. The Veld is an area in the game where the player can take Gao to learn enemy skills. In this area, Gao obtains an ability called Leap, which allows him to go with a group of enemies and learn their skills. The problem is that there are hundreds of enemies in this game, and Gao can learn an ability for every single one of them. Of course, not all of these enemy skills are going to be very useful, so the player will likely only want to learn a handful of the most powerful ones. Unfortunately, finding the appropriate enemies on the Veld turns out to be an enormous headache, ultimately becoming nothing more than a horrible, time-consuming grindfest. Another thing I really hate about this game is the Colosseum. In the Colosseum, you match your characters one-on-one with enemies in hopes of obtaining rare items and equipment, some of which can't be found anywhere else in the game. The idea is that the player bets an item from his or her inventory for a chance to win an even better one. All it takes is beating the enemy in one-on-one combat. Simple enough. If you win, you get the enemy's item. If you're defeated, you lose the item that you bet. At first, I was intrigued by this concept of a high-risk, high-reward gamble, but then I found out that once you get into the battle, you lose control of your character. Why? Why on earth would you set it up that way? The reason I hate this so much is because there are some pretty amazing strategies out there that can help the player defeat enemies that are much higher in level than your party members in order to gain some great rewards. The only problem is that the actions of your characters in these battles are random, so they rarely do what they should in order to win the fight. They end up doing some of the most idiotic things you can possibly imagine. And this made the Colosseum, which was an overall interesting concept, an extremely frustrating aspect of the game when put into practice. It must be said again, however, that the Veld and the Colosseum are totally optional, and if you don't want to invest the time required to gain the rewards they provide, you don't have to. Not doing so, however, basically eliminates Gao's uniqueness in battle and will cause you to miss out on some of the game's best equipment. So it's not like there's nothing to lose by avoiding this content. Of course, I could never wrap up a review of this game without first talking about the music. What else can be said about Nobuo Uematsu? The man is a genius, and he really shows it with this score. The extensive use of leitmotif is probably its most defining feature, and is used to the same extent in a 16-bit video game as it's used by renowned composers in feature Hollywood films. While all of Uematsu's music is amazing, the soundtrack for Final Fantasy VI is widely considered to be his masterwork, showcasing both his range in musical style as well as his ability to carefully manipulate the desired emotional response from the player. This isn't just one of the best soundtracks in the series, it's one of the best soundtracks in video game history. Overall, Final Fantasy VI is a masterpiece with a few very minor but ultimately misguided design decisions. Fortunately, most of those missteps are contained within optional content and are so dramatically overshadowed by what the game does right that they can be easily forgiven once the credits roll. It has amazing visuals that still hold up today, a wonderful cast of characters which include a fascinating and complex assortment of villains, a well-constructed and thoughtful story, fun and involving game mechanics with a few exceptions, and an incredible musical score. I give Final Fantasy VI 4.5 sick-looking steampunk airships out of 5.